I am not a machine. I am very messy in my process, and it seems to work on the level of creating good output. What I'm trying to solve for is to increase the pace of the output, because that's probably my biggest frustration with my work. I could do more. I want to do more.
I am so excited about this episode because it is all things the creative process. We talk about how do you find your project, and then how do you create a project that you're working on, and then sharing your work and putting it out into the world. I was joined by my friend Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg, who is the author of What's Your Problem?, a Harvard Business Press 2020 book on how to solve the right problems. He is also the co-author of Innovation as Usual, a Harvard Business Review Press book on the art of driving innovation in regular organizations. He was a guest on my other podcast, Lead with Culture, and I had to invite him on to Create for No Reason because after that interview I had with him, we dug into the creative process and poetry and writing and all things creativity. And so I thought that it would be a really fun conversation to share with you. And I hope, as always, it inspires you in your creative work. Thomas, it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
So thank you, Kate.
I am so excited because this is our second podcast that we're doing together. I got to have you as a guest on Lead with Culture, which was so fun. And we talked a lot about your book and are you solving for the right problem? So you wrote this book, What's Your Problem? Which I just love that title. It's such a good title. But you really developed this framework around how to figure out if you are actually solving the right problem. And then from that conversation, you and I talked offline about creativity and writing and poetry and all of these things. And I said, oh my God, we have to have you come on Create for No Reason to talk about this. Well, really just to talk more about the creative process. And so you and I have been talking and we shared a little bit about, okay, what do we want to share with the listeners today? And you had thrown out this idea of project finding. How do you decide what project to work on? We've been having these conversations. I said, we're going to talk all about it on the podcast so that everyone can hear the frameworks that you develop, the way that you think about project finding, and anyone listening is going to have a better idea at the end of this episode of, okay, what should I actually spend my time creating for myself and for the world? So that's the high overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that's exactly right. For me, it came from, I've always been interested in problems. And then it struck me, there is this problem that all people who want to create something new face, namely, what should I create? And you know, we call it here, in the literature, it's sometimes called problem finding, but I think project finding is a good term for it. Of all the possible things I could do, in all the possible formats I could do it, what should I actually focus on? And that is I'm curious about it because it's both sometimes the messiest part of the process, and it's so consequential. Like once you, as you well know, once you decide to say write a book, I mean, you're married to that thing for years, both writing it and then after talking about it and so on. So it's such a consequential choice, and yet it felt to me like the most unexplored aspect of the creative process. I don't know if that was your experience, but that's kind of where I was coming in from.
Well, I think why it really resonated with me so much when you wrote that was, yes, I think it definitely is important to explore. And I've created, like, I have 2 podcasts. I wrote a book. I create videos. I feel like sometimes it's, okay, hold on. Am I doing too much? For some people, they're very intentional around, like, some of the big creators that I follow, they very intentionally decided against podcasting because they spend their time writing books and they are so clear on that decision. And I think today it is so easy for us to do it all, right? Like you can write, do all the things. You can have the podcast and the videos and do everything. But if you're doing that, are you really being intentional about the message that you're sharing and the work that you're creating? So I think that's really important because whether it's the book that you decide to do or if you decide to create podcasts, like you have to kind of say, here's the stake in the ground. I'm going to do this for at least a year, 2 years to see what happens with it. So I find that to be interesting. And then also around, if you're going to create it, how are you going to keep it fresh and new and interesting week after week after week?
Yeah. Let me offer you a reflection here that I love your reaction to. But I think if you're looking at that choice around what format you want to share things in, is it a book? Is it a podcast? Is it a newsletter? Whatever. There's two different purposes playing into that. And one purpose is like what helps the audience, what's right for the audience in this context. Does my audience kind of prefer daily video stuff or whatever, or is a book a better option here? The other purpose, and I think this is really interesting in the project finding process, is how does this help you hone and refine your ideas? Because the big problem with books I found is it's like a one-shot thing. You send it out there and you hope you got it right. Whereas the second you choose to work with a newsletter, a podcast or something, that creates a much better feedback loop for you. I didn't do that with my first two books. What did it for me was classrooms. So I went into, both teaching and kind of working with executives and stuff. Those were my feedback loops that allowed me to kind of gradually suss out, oh, this is the really interesting project I want to do. So maybe what do you think of that consideration, or is there anything more we should add to that?
No, I think that's interesting that you discovered that and then looked back and said, oh, I didn't really do that for my first two books, because that feels like a lot of pressure, Thomas, to sit there and not get feedback from something that you're working on and then immediately putting it out into the world.
Yeah.
When I was writing my book, I didn't have a stage well, I wasn't in a classroom like you. But I was on Clubhouse. Do you remember Clubhouse?
Yeah.
I was in this community on Clubhouse, and for those that might not know, it was an audio only app that lots of people got on in 2020 when everyone was at home and we weren't able to be out and about with friends. And so it was this kind of a mix of like radio and podcasting, but in real time. And were on stage with people and or on quote unquote on stage, but it was just audio. And I was in part of this community, and every week I had a segment. So every week I had to come up with something to
Nice.
say, and it was 30 minutes. And so some of what I was able to decide was, oh, I shared this topic and people loved it. And that really works in my book. I was like, I'm going to put this in the book. In fact, I have this section of the book, 7 ways to be your own muse. That was literally one of the sessions that I had done in the Clubhouse room that people really loved, and just kind of, I got a lot of feedback afterwards. So that was really helpful for me. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really happy that you decided to do a newsletter, because I think newsletters are such a great way to force yourself to create consistently. And then B, you get to really flesh out what works, what doesn't, and then how to improve. So you can take something that you wrote this week and maybe it wasn't the best, but that's okay, because now you have a way to improve upon it next week and go on from there.
Yeah, and that taps into, I think, something else you write about in a different chapter, about what you call the passion loop, which is the recognition that once you move past perfectionism, good things happen because you put something imperfect into the world, and then lots of good things happen. Like you get clearer on it, you start to attract people, you get into conversations and so on. And I think that when I read that in your book, I think that was very true. And I recognize that had in the past kind of helped me back, that it's really good to create forcing functions for yourself where you put out smaller tidbits of work that allow you to hone it. I think I could have sped up my first two books a lot if I'd done that more systematically, rather than waiting for things that force me to it, kind of without me setting it up, so to speak. So I think that is very true.
So you've obviously written books, and which is so much work. Writing books is so much work. And now you're doing this newsletter. I have to say, I printed out a couple of them because they're just really good. And I think that you have a different kind of brain and way of thinking than I do. So of course I appreciate it because I'm like looking at some of the frameworks that you develop and you're very good at I mean it's more than just developing the frameworks, but it's just really honing in on like even with you, even in your book What's Your Problem, you have the framework of hey, this is how you're going to figure out how to are you solving the right problem and then go ahead and solve it. So how are you thinking about your newsletter? How are you deciding what to put in it? How do you decide what like overall the theme and then figuring out like do you plan weeks ahead? Is this like a weekly thing that you're just kind of like this is what I'm curious about?
I love people who could take a structured approach to things because I'm not one of them. I have
You are.
no, I realized about myself, I am relentlessly driven by my own interests. And like the idea that my past self can control my present self by creating a to-do list, like, no, forget it. Like, I just wake up in the morning, which idiot wrote this? No, I'm gonna work on this thing over here. Like, so the only trick I found there is just to, for instance, like in the morning, sit down with something when I have breakfast, read something I'm kind of curious about, and that spurs me onto writing something in that domain or whatever. But if I were to tell you that this is this organized process, I would utterly be lying. The newsletter is simply a thing, an experiment for me to put things out there, in particular, kind of work in progress things. And like what once we're done with this, I'm actually gonna be posting like notes on problem and project finding, just to kind of put some initial. It's almost like a public draft, maybe a little bit more polished than that. Again, in order to try to force myself to speed up the process of honing my ideas and kind of finding that the crux of the project I'm doing. Out of curiosity, what was your not that I think we don't necessarily need to get super into the kind of daily process, was like, how did you arrive at your project? And I'm thinking now, you do many things, but like, I'm thinking now specifically of like the Do What You Love book, where it caught me, as I mentioned to you earlier, as like a guide to living your creative life without leaving your job, which I think is such a critical thing. Um, how did you land there? What was your project finding process on that?
And we're not done talking about your newsletter,
Oh
by the
no.
way. So I had wanted to write a book for years, and then this topic is so dear to me because fortunately, I've just always loved my work. And when I work, wherever it was that I worked, whether because I've worked for people, I've worked for myself, I've had my own business. And no matter what I was doing for work, I always did something on the creative side. Like the start of my career, like way back when, many years ago,
Mm.
like I remember when like social media started coming out. I I loved the idea of video and YouTube, and so I bought a little pink flip cam. Remember the flip
Yeah,
cam?
man.
I had a flip cam and I brought it to Chamber of Commerce events and I would say, "Hey, let's do a little video and talk about what you just talked about on stage," like with some of our speakers. And so I feel like I always think about when it comes to what projects that I want to work on, like what is my perspective and how is it different? Somebody asked me one time when I was thinking about writing a book, it's a mentor of mine and he said, "What book can only you write?" That's what I love. I love this idea of putting this up. What podcast can only you create? Or what YouTube channel can only you create? And so I thought, wow, this is the book that I know I can write. I'm no expert on creativity by any means, but I do know that I've constantly pursued creative passions. And that's so much of what the book is about. And it's so funny about the title because cannot tell you how many hours I spent on the subtitle of this book. I mean, hours. Like, I remember I was
For
on the
good reason.
phone and shout
Yeah.
out to my friend Jeremy. And I talk about creative friends in the book because we need creative friends. And I was on the phone with him one night for like an hour and a half, and we were just brainstorming and just putting them on paper. And then I remember I got off the phone with him and I wanted to have the answer. I'm like, no, we cannot get off the phone. And it was like 1 a.m. and he's like, I have to go. And so he's like, we will reconvene. But I kept brainstorming, and finally came up with this subtitle. And you know what's funny? It was like a couple months before publishing. And I said, man, should I get rid of the without leaving your job? Almost got rid of that sentence,
Yeah, I know.
but
Yeah.
what I figured was, no, like, that's what makes it different than every other book about the creative process. That's, like, the one thing that really differentiates it. It's like, this isn't a book about leaving your job and becoming an artist. This is literally no matter what you're doing in your life and your career, you can be creative and you can pursue your passions and figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
Maybe they will become how you earn an income. Maybe they will just stay as the joys of your life that you absolutely love to pursue. And that's why, but I mean, you said you almost didn't call your book "What's Your Problem" because it was a little controversial in the
Yeah.
Harvard Business Review space.
Yeah, exactly. I think I love that kind of question of what book can only you write, because it actually does something interesting. It's not just elevating your specific strengths. And like with you, you had accrued all of this thinking and experience with creative projects over your life. I think it also forces you to examine, like, how do I stand out from what's out there? Because the reality is there's endless amounts of stuff. Like,
Yeah.
there's books coming out every single day on, for instance, just art, like our topic, creativity. And so, unless you're just doing it as a project just for you, I think it is really helpful to reflect on, where can I actually add something here? What is a thing in this space around creativity that is less well solved for or explored or similar? And I think you and I, interestingly enough, we before wrote "What's Your Problem," my first book was called "Innovation as Usual," and very much in the same kind of more of a business-oriented take on that question: how do you do this as part of a day job? So you and I, interestingly, noticed the exact same issue, that it's easy enough to be creative if you, well, not easy, but easier if that's your day job. But what if you work in a regular, normal human being job and you also want to do this? Like, that's a real interesting challenge. And when you can go in and you give advice to people on that, you are starting to add value in a way that I think is more significant than if you hadn't done the work of figuring out what is unique about my thing. And I think that's also where you start to see much bigger resonance and kind of broader audiences if you hit something unexplored, or underdeveloped.
Yeah, and don't you think most people don't believe that they are creative? And but we are all creative. Like, we're all creative in our own way, and so helping people figure out what that looks like, and not everybody, I don't mean creative in the sense that everyone wants to write or start a podcast or write a screenplay or any of those things. It really is creativity in their own, whether that means for them it's gardening or playing music or jujitsu or whatever their form of art. But that idea, that's why you have this framework in your newsletters that I love, because you were talking about how do you find your differentiator, and you have this little sentence that I felt
Yeah.
like, oh, I was trying to figure out what mine was, but I really loved that. Can you describe this idea that you put together of, like, how do you find your differentiator to see what it is
Yeah.
that makes your work unique?
Yeah. So this comes out of a conversation I had with two of my friends who are also deep thinkers on this, Sheila Heen and Doug Stone, who wrote Difficult Conversations, Thanks for the Feedback, and so on. And the sentence is basically, when it comes to blank, people think that blank, but actually. And to unpack that a little bit, first and foremost, you have to understand what problem or goal you're speaking to. Like, and this may be a little bit less true if you're painting, I would say, but if you're doing some kind of, like, writing a book for somebody, what are you helping them with? Are you helping them have a better marriage? Are you helping them be creative as part of their daily job? Are you helping them understand finance better? Whatever. So anchoring it first and foremost in the person or the reader's need, or at least one of them. And then I think the crux of the sentence is really that understanding that often what makes your idea stand out is that it is counterintuitive compared to what people already know. And here's an example of that. I'll flesh it out in the sentence, but Tony Schwartz, who's a thinker within, like, the getting things done movement, one of the key things he put out was basically this notion, when it comes to getting things done, people think it's about managing your time, but actually it's about managing your energy. If some of your listeners might be familiar with that work already, but I think that's a really good example of this thing, right? That smart people who want to get stuff done, they focus on managing their time, they're optimizing their calendar, blah, blah, blah. And what Tony Schwartz came in and said here, this is an HB article he published with one of his colleagues, was basically to say, well, yes, but actually you want to focus on your energy and how you manage that, because that is an equally or more important aspect of it. And that's the thing, crucially, people were missing. So a lot of smart people were solving for the time management thing, but people didn't really have the energy thing on their radar, nor did they have great tools or frameworks for how to think about that. So that's kind of, that's an example of how to use that sentence. It's good to surface which of your ideas contrast with what smart people already think. Like what stands out, what's surprising or counterintuitive. Those things tend to be really powerful compared to, evidently compared to telling people what they already know. So in when it comes to some kind of problem, people think that, but actually, and that's where you come in with your notion or your framework or whatever it is. But yeah, tell me about, what were your reactions for,
when you think about your work, well, after I read that, I was like, oh, so how do you think about this, Thomas? I was like, what is your, but actually?
I'd say I'll give two examples with the two books. So the most recent one, it's very simple. It's just kind of like people think it's about analyzing problems, but it's actually about framing them the right way. So making sure you're solving the right problem, not just the act of analyzing and solving it. That's kind of the core of that book. With this one, it was interesting, and this maybe tap into a bigger framework. You can think of this notion almost that you might have an umbrella idea, and then beneath that you have subsidiary ideas that may also have that dynamic. So the umbrella idea we already spoke about, that the key challenge is to focus on being creative when you have a day job. Under that, with this one, for instance, even in each chapter, I kind of had one of those. So one example was, when it comes to looking for good ideas, people think it's about giving others freedom, but in actuality, it's much better if as a leader you go in and focus the search. So instead of just like, hey, let's do blue sky brainstorming, all ideas are good ideas, doesn't work so well in practice. What tends to work better is to go in, if you're a leader of a team, say, hey folks, we have this challenge here that is really important to our business and we don't have a solution for it. Can you focus your creative brains on that? Because if you come up with something there, we know that's going to be really impactful. So that's an example. When it comes to looking for good ideas, people think it's about creating freedom and removing boundaries. Actually, no, you want to go in and focus the search for the idea. That's another example. Where would you say, I know I'm kind of shifting it back to you all the time, but like, is there somewhere in your work where you saw a similar dynamic?
Yeah, I know. I'm like, Thomas thinks this is his podcast all of a sudden. He thinks
I know.
maybe one day you'll have a podcast. No, but I'm excited because we're gonna do more episodes together. Well, it's funny because I was really thinking about this. I was looking through it and I was like, oh, I'm gonna have to come to this episode like with what's my thing. And honestly, I feel like, well, I was looking at it from two perspectives. One, I would have to create one for the work that I do with Floyd, with Dream Manager and coaching and on all of that. But from this perspective, when I think about my creative work, I was thinking about it as like creativity, like kind of what I just said, which is more around when it comes to this doesn't work because probably doesn't work, but my initial thought was when it comes to creativity, people think that they are not creative, but actually we're all creative in our own way. But I'd have to like really flesh it out and get a better, I know that the purpose of this is that people, when they read it, they're like, oh, that's for me. That's me. That's what I love about like the greatest work and the greatest books are when someone describes it, or even if you just read the title, you think, oh, that's for me. Like that is for
Yeah.
me. Like this podcast is for me. This episode is for me. That book is for me. And so I think that's part of when I think about my creative work, I do feel it can feel a little bit too broad sometimes.
I mean, this is one of the interesting things to me about the work of project finding is kind of gradual. That you start with some kind of vague sense of what the thing is, and then as you work with it, as you talk to people, as you kind of use a framework like this or whatever, you start to really distill it, and until you kind of like, that's it. And that was my process for both of my books. It took me years to really understand, oh, this is the thing. I would say, just because I always have this framework in the back of my mind, when I looked at your work, I felt like I immediately sensed that you had done a lot of it already. Like the muse example we spoke about before is a good one. Like, when it comes to finding inspiration, people think it's about just waiting for the muse to come and whisper to you. And you say, no, no, no. You have to create traps for the muse. Like you have to set up the circumstances that make inspiration happen, instead of just thinking that this is a thunderbolt striking you from the sky. That to me is a great example of where you see that underlying logic of servicing the myth that many smart people believe in, which helps they both connect to it. They're like, oh, I thought it was like that. And I think it really showcases the power of your approach and why that is important. So, I mean, I think you do it a lot. This kind of, but it is so interesting to try to even identify where it's happening in your work, because I think my point is being deliberate about looking for it can speed up the process.
Yeah.
Otherwise we're stuck with, from my first to my second book, it took 7 years. And I'm kind of like, I'd like to create a little bit more than that in my life. So,
Wow. Well, yeah. I mean, some people will never ever write a book, but it's what I love about what you just shared, and thank you very much, because I feel like this is why we need creative friends in our lives, right? Because I think we are often our own worst critic.
yeah.
And so when just like with you, when I'm looking at your newsletter, I'm thinking your brain works this way. You're like, no, actually, it's not how it works. I have to force myself to really dig in and to create this. And it's such a good reminder of the creative process, and that it really does take, like, the reason why it's one of my favorite quotes. I would have written a shorter note. I just didn't have the time.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's like we
Very true.
resonate with that work. Matthew Kelly has written over 40 books. They've resonated with millions and millions of people, but he's able to write the first manuscript might have been 100,000 words that he has to pare down to 40,000 words to make it a book. No one's
Yeah.
going to read the 100,000s, but we're going to read the 40. And those 40 are like, you want to highlight so much of the book. But it takes a lot of work to get there, and it takes a lot of honing in. And I think what's interesting to me is when you talk about it took 7 years. Well, now you've figured out that gap and how to shorten that gap. So now it won't take you 7 years to write your next one. And then the next one will be even more like sooner. And because you're developing these frameworks, but this is all the creative process, and I love it so much. And I also get so frustrated by it.
I think that is the unifying experience, the mix of kind of excitement and frustration. And it can be a little difficult for people to face the frustration, because we have this myth of like, oh yeah, creativity is always so fun. And the reality is it's a roller coaster ride. And I mean, half of it is just project management, which is like, who enjoys that? Well, maybe some people do. So, but it is true. There is something very generative in kind of starting to put your ideas out there, starting to have conversations like what we're having now, creating newsletters, whatever. And it took me a while to realize that, even though I'm technically an innovation expert, this is disconcerting. Yeah.
So when you start a new project, you have your newsletter. Is it weekly, monthly? What's your cadence?
I realized that after I put it out. So again, there is nothing structured here. It is like an example, as I said earlier. the fact that we have this call today made me decide that, oh, great, I was sitting and taking a lot of notes for this call. After this call, I'm going to put that into a post and put it out there. That's how my writing happens. That there is nothing, whenever I try again to say, I'm going to put out something every Wednesday.
Oh my gosh, it's so fun. Because I think I think there's good and bad to it, right? There is, who was it? I think there's somebody that does a newsletter, and he even shares, a lot of newsletters will say every Tuesday morning or every Sunday or every other Sunday or whatever it is. But then somebody said, I remember reading, I forget whose it was, but they said, sign up for my newsletter. You'll get it sporadically in your inbox. And it made me laugh because, hey, at least you're setting the expectation to someone. You're going to get it when you get it. But I'm rereading Kent Nurburne's book, Dancing with the Gods, which is one of my favorite books. And one of the things that he talks about is that as an artist, you have to, and when I say artist, it's you're creating anything in the world. And it's this idea of when do you share your work, right? Like perfectionism can definitely hold us back from sharing our work. So when you're developing this work, obviously you have a book. At some point you have to say, okay, it's published, it's out there. But when you are writing a newsletter, how do you decide, okay, this work is complete and done? It's not perfect because nothing's perfect, but I'm going to let it out.
It always takes longer than I think. So I will sit down and say, oh, I should have this banged out in 2 hours. And then at 11 o'clock at night, I might kind of feel, okay, it's there. Or then I go, let me give it another spin tomorrow. So what I do is relentlessly edit as I write. I put it together, then I revisit that sentence 4 times in my head and kind of micro tweak it. And then I write the next bit, and then I have a bit further down. And at some point, I decide that whole section, it's not that great. I'll just take that out after spending 2 hours on it. I don't think there is a point where it is perfect. This has been part of the process for me of doing the newsletter, of kind of accepting that this is kind of be rough. What really helps me is I can change it later. I can go back to I use Substack. I can go back to that thing and then I can revise it, which really helps because that you don't have that option with a book. I would say there are also other media that are more, in my head, forgiving. This is an example. The Second Unit podcast, it's kind of as is, and people understand that. So there's no need to revise podcasts. And, this is actually a partial response to your question around the cadence of putting out work. What works for me is to create forcing functions that involve other people. So when I said, yeah, let's do another podcast thing, well, that forces me to think about this and to get into that headspace. So that's the closest thing I have to structure. Whenever I try to set it for myself, it just does not work. End of story. And I've kind of recognized that about myself.
Oh my gosh. It's so interesting. And I think it's helpful for people to hear because one, I think a lot of us, even though we know we shouldn't compare, it's easy to compare ourselves to other people and other people's work. And because so many people are putting things out into the world, we often think, oh, they do it very confidently. They have this perfect cadence and their desk is probably super clean and they have everything in their files. And we're all so much more similar than we think that we are. And I think it's important to hear. This is why I love doing this podcast, because I think it's important to hear people's workflow and work process and know that it's messy. It is messy, and that's okay. And it takes time to figure these pieces out. And it's necessary.
I'm sure you're familiar with his work too, Oliver Berkman's approach, which is one of the examples he uses is to look at your inbox as a river. You're sitting, or your to-do list as a river. You're sitting and seeing all these things sail by. You might choose to engage with some of them. It's like a menu. It's not a thing you have to slavishly work through. I like that perspective because, there might be some people out there who are machines, and I envy to some extent and admire that. I am not a machine. I am very messy in my process, and it seems to work on the level of creating good output. What I'm trying to solve for is to increase the pace of the output. because that's probably my biggest frustration with my work. I could do more, and I want to do more. I think it is helpful to, be accepting of your, not even flaws, just your humanity, and kind of find a way to work with that, versus this punitive, you must be a creativity machine perspective, which is cracking. Oh my God, that's straining. So yeah.
Yeah.
People can differ, I think. There are some that are better at like being high on conscientiousness. They're probably better at sitting down every day and getting the thing done.
Yeah, everyone's got a different process, and the level of work is different. With people that like immediately, I thought when you shared that, it was like when people talk about the algorithm. Oh, I have to post 3 times a day, or this is what you need to do, a weekly thing, or whatever the cadence is that is necessary. And then some people say, okay, well, I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to do this once a month. But what I produce is going to be very thoughtful and take a lot of time, and it's going to be very well produced. And there's a big difference between that and then that's putting out 3 videos a day on TikTok. Both are great, but they're just very different. That's why I think it is important for people to really understand their work process and then work through it. And then if you want to have a better output, then great, you can figure out what that looks like for you. But that is going to look different than somebody that's over on TikTok that just really enjoys. I've heard some people that are creating like 10 videos a day, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that sounds exhausting. But if it's their world, then that is awesome and it works for them. And I think that's important. And then I think also just when you decide, like with what you're working on now, you want to be creating books, and now you have this newsletter. Is there any other medium that you're going to be playing around with, or is that really the format for you, is writing?
I think writing is my core thing. I have not been drawn to do videos. I've not podcasting. I flirted with the idea, but it felt I don't know. I like the permanence of something written. It does. Apart from the permanence, it also creates. It forces you to be more rigorous in your thinking. Like to me, writing is thinking, and writing is a specific form of thinking that lets you get away with less hand waving. Because if I am to give a talk or do like a video on something, I can kind of like waffle my way through that. Whereas if I'm writing, at least the way I approach writing, I can smell the weaknesses in my own arguments better. I can tell like, ooh, that example I'm sharing here, it doesn't actually illustrate the point I wanted to illustrate. And I love that rigor because I think that's the way you create really good work. I have 2 different parts of my brain here when it comes to like the frequent creation. I have one that is, and I'm gonna sound like an asshole now, but I'm just super judgy. Like when people put out stuff, really, it's kind of like meh, and I'm like, okay, this is just a useless person. I'm not gonna listen to them. Now, that's one part of my brain. That's often my instinctive reaction. But then I notice several things. First and foremost, the people who put out stuff frequently, but in something I'm interested in, I'm really into that. So I'm not always like sure about it. And when you look at the research into creativity and innovation, there's a very clear link between frequency of putting stuff out and the ultimate quality of what you produce. So the research at least suggests that it is a good idea to find ways of increasing your output, because then eventually you have a greater chance of hitting something that really is going to be epically big or whatever. I struggle with this. One of the reasons I have been reluctant to put out newsletters is my own judgy attitude towards stuff that's not really thought through and strong. And I'm kind of recognizing that might not always serve me well. That instinct. I know we're supposed in the creative world to say like, oh, everything's good and great and so on, but that's not true. There's a lot of crap out there.
Oh my God. Yeah. And I don't think we're supposed to say that. Obviously, I mean, I always look at it from a perspective of it's for someone else. It's not for me. Like, that's the thing. It's like, and I feel like that is because I can feel similarly sometimes around some work, and I will watch a video or read something, and I'm just thinking that it doesn't feel like it feels very different when someone puts a lot of love and attention into it or when they don't. But that's not to say that that person that wrote something in 10 minutes and got it out, that it wasn't meaningful to somebody else, because to someone else, they might never have heard it. It might be exactly what they needed to hear. And so that's what I love about this kind of work. And I love that's a great place to kind of encourage people around cadence today. I feel like that's a good, like, last step of the more that you do, the more you create, the better that you get, the more succinct you are in your writing and or whatever it is that you're creating. You get better at whatever you're creating. And it also helps you discover what direction you want to go and where you want to take it. And so I think that's a good next step for whatever anyone's working on.
I want to add an anecdote here, because linking back to kind of the question of judging, because evidently part of what you do when you create creative work is to judge. Like, is this good enough, or is this not what I should be focused on? I once saw a talk together with my old mentor and co-author, Patty Miller, who was one of my professors, 30 years older than me. And this person who was giving the talk, it was bad. Like, it was just like, oh, you know that thing, you're sitting here, oh my God, I'm trapped here, 45 minutes. And then I was sitting and like listening to this guy speak, and just like my critical brain was in full motion. Like, no, this is also wrong. Oh no, that goes against the research. What's this guy talking about? Like, Then I look over at Patty, and Patty is happily scribbling. And I'm like, what is going on over there? And I asked him afterwards, like, wait, Patty, didn't you think that guy was crap, right? And Patty said, oh, yeah. But he made me think. I used him to think. Like, and that to me was such a big shift, because sometimes you're stuck in something terrible. But Patty's approach was to say, okay, I'm going to use this as input to arrive at something new and fascinating. I'm going to look for the good, useful thing in it. And weirdly, this mirrored when I wrote my first book. My first draft was not great. I mean, it was rough. It was kind of, I thought I could become Malcolm Gladwell, but I don't have Malcolm Gladwell's storytelling abilities, And I noticed Harvard has a peer review system. And one of the peer reviewers, I later found out this was Scott Anthony, who's now a friend. He's an author of theirs on innovation as well. His feedback was super helpful, because he was mercilessly critical about the ideas and the weak points, but he also saw the potential. He said, like, these parts of the book are really interesting, and I think you can create something fantastic if you develop that more. And this chapter is terrible, and you should really work on that more. That was such a good distinction. Like, see the critical stuff because you need it. Your first thing is not going to be good enough. However, also see the potential of what it can become, and like believe in the person's ability to get there. I think that is a really helpful mindset to get into.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that. It reminds me of Ira Glass's Taste Gap.
Oh, same. What's that? I don't know that.
Oh my gosh, did a whole episode on the Taste Gap. So I'll have to send it to you, and I'll send you what it is. But basically, it's this beautifully written piece that he shares around the Taste Gap. And basically, he's talking about how you get into any type of creative work because you have good taste. Like, you have good taste. And you appreciated Malcolm Gladwell. You want to write this book, and you're like, okay, my taste is here, but my ability is only here. I know what good is, and I know I can create it, but you don't necessarily have the capabilities of creating what you know is going to be like stellar work. But you have to do the work in order to minimize that gap, like close that gap. But it's basically doing all the things we've been talking about today. It's like showing up, it's doing the work, it's figuring yourself out, it's figuring out your perspective. And I think about that all the time, because if you're growing and learning, you can always kind of be in the taste gap, because if you start something new, like for me, have recently got into poetry, as you know. And so I'm like, to me, I feel like I'm right at, I'm now the taste gap is, I see it all over, because I know what good poetry looks like because it feels a certain way to me. And I am not there yet, but I want to be there. I feel like I can get there. But so it's basically describing what you just said, which I think is beautiful.
So I'll share an anecdote there too, where I've always written poetry. It's been like a side thing for me because I'm just really into language. And thinking back of your passion loop, what very specifically happened was I had written poetry. I'd never shown it to anyone. I had at that time an apartment where I had a lot of wall space. And so I had put up, while I was working on, I think it was my university thesis, I also had a corner of my wall space that was like where I'd put up a couple of poems I was working on. My second cousin comes for a visit. There's so much stuff on the walls that I'm sure she'll never see that corner. And of course, she beelines over to that corner for some reason and immediately starts reading one of my poems. Here's what's so interesting to me. Before she read it, I had a deep sense of dread. I was like, 2 seconds later, literally the second she read it, it kind of said something. I was like, oh, this is perfectly fine. Like, it was so surprising to me in retrospect to notice that all of the things I had predicted around how terrible it would be to put this thing out there and have another person react to it just were not true at all. Like, at all. It was my ability to predict my future self's reaction, 0. And that there's research on this. I think is it Dan Gilbert, like stumbling onto happiness is called something affective forecasting, that you're really terrible at understanding how your future self will feel about something. This is very true with at least, I think, some of the fears that people have around sharing their work or whatever. Before they do it, they think it's the end of the world. The second they do it, they realize this is fine, and it might even be enjoyable, which it was to me. So, odd anecdote.
I love that. No, I think that's so important, because I do think a lot of people have something that they created and just too scared to share it. And so I think this is such a nice little push to share your work, because I feel like one or two things are going to happen. You'll probably be pleasantly surprised, or the other thing, which is you probably won't even get much feedback, especially in the beginning. So either way, but like, you did your part and you put it out. And I think just having that courage to put things out into the world alone is important. And it just helps us in that creative process and helps us gain a little bit more confidence.
Yeah, and there's so many ways to do it in low-key stakes. I mean, it's not as if I took that poem and put it on a Times Square billboard.
Right.
I showed it to one other person by accident. So I think that there's a lot of ways where if the listeners here are struggling with that particular thing, like do it with a small group or whatever, with people you'll never meet again. I learned a lot from, I at one point briefly dated somebody who had published poetry, and I showed her one of the poems, and she actually sat down and edited it in front of me, which was incredibly powerful and like really, really interesting to see. She spoke out loud as she went through it, and I just like, my knowledge around how to do that for the future wildly accelerated. For her, it was like, she sat down for 15 minutes, and here it is. This is going to be better. Yep. So, yeah.
Well, that's so cool. All right. So when you come back, maybe would you read us your piece of poetry?
I'll find one that I can read.
Cool. I love it. Well, Thomas, this has been so fun. I feel like this is such the epitome of the creative process. All the topics we dove into today is really just so much around the struggles that we go through creating anything, from choosing the platform to creating it to then sharing it, all the things.
I can share a quick 4-line poem right now if you want it.
Yes, please.
I haven't yet figured out whether this is the full thing or just a fragment of a starting thing or whatever, but here it goes. I love all that's differently made, filled with desire for a different fate. That's it.
I love that.
Uh,
Do you feel like when you read it, do you feel like it's complete or do you feel like it's a piece of something else?
I still don't know. I like it in its present form, and there's always that challenge of like, if you feel like something is a good thing, and then you try to add something that's not there. I very often have projects that I've been mulling for years, and at some point I return to them and kind of amp them up or similar. But that's a super brief version of it. I really like the short ones. Like what's that? uh, this is somebody, I don't remember the author's name. It's an old one, but like, on love, on grief, on every human thing, time spreads less water with its wing. Just that notion that time allows you to heal all wounds. Except I want to change it to time spreads Nutella with its wings. Humor is a different topic. Yes.
Oh my gosh. I love it. Oh my gosh. Well, Thomas, I'm excited to have you come back. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your creative process. And I'm looking forward to another conversation.
Me too. Thank you, Kate.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Thomas. Like I said, we're going to have him come back on the show because we can talk about this topic for hours and hours because there's just so much in it. There's so much to talk about when it comes to our creativity, when it comes to the work that we want to produce and share with the world. So many different perspectives and so many different ways to approach it. So as usual, I hope that there was at least one idea, something in this episode that inspired you to move your creative work forward. I hope that you are inspired to look at your work differently, and maybe there's a piece of work that you have been holding on to that you want to actually share with the world. Whatever that is for you, I hope that you found a lot of value in this episode. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. And until next time, go create something.